This week, two views from other parts of the world. First up, how do authoritarian leaders take hold and perpetuate their rule? Anne Applebaum will be here to discuss her latest book, Twilight of Democracy. Where is the world capital of self-immolations? Barbara Demick will join us to talk about her book, Eat the Buddha, Life and Death in a Tibetan Town. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, Tina Jordan, John Williams, and I will talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's July 31st. I'm Pamela Paul. Anne Applebaum joins us now from London. She is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Gulag, A History, and her new book is called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Anne, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I want to start with a very basic language question because people are throwing around a lot of terms these days: authoritarianism, dictatorship, demagoguery, autocracy, fascism, and sort of get to an understanding of what we exactly mean and what you mean here by authoritarianism.
My book is about democracies, really, and it's about people and political movements in democracies who become dissatisfied with their own political systems and seek to change them radically. And I agree with you that it's hard to sometimes describe what it is that they want to go towards, whether it's a one-party state or a illiberal democracy or a, not necessarily a dictatorship, but a system in which there's less openness and less competition. And so, my book is about that. It's about the disappointment that some people feel with democracy and the draw towards more authoritarianism, more centralized, less competitive, less open political systems.
You're not so much concerned in this book with the specifics of the autocrats of our time, the Erdogans and Putins and Orbans, so much as you are with the people who vote for them, side with them, enable them. Why did you decide to look at it from that angle?
Well, actually, it's explicitly not a book about voters. I mean, I think the reason why people vote for populist or authoritarian parties are various, and I that's sort of a separate subject. But you're right, it is a book about journalists, spin doctors, intellectuals, and the people who sometimes help create these movements, who create the ideas behind them, and then sometimes sell those ideas to the general public. Partly I wrote about them because those are people I know. Not all of them are my close friends, but some of them are people I've run into. And it's a world I know. And I thought it would be useful, therefore, for me to try and explain them and understand what happened to them over the last 20 years.
I want to look at Erdogan because when you talk about journalists and intellectuals, he's someone who, and I think we could say this probably about Putin and Orban and others as well, these are people who have suppressed the press, limited journalists, closed down newspapers, imprisoned writers. Who are the people on the other side? Who are these other journalists and intellectuals who are supporting someone like Erdogan, for example, in Turkey?
Well, some of them are people who have become convinced that there's only one form of Turkish patriotism and that it's a nationalist form of patriotism, and that anybody who has a different vision of Turkey, a vision of Turkey that's integrated with Europe or a Turkey that's secular, those people are traitors to the country and their voices don't deserve to be heard. Some of them will have other motives. Some of them will be opportunists. Some of them will see the chance of, if you get on the government's bandwagon and you get on state media, then it's a way to make a career. Some of them will like the proximity to power. I mean, there's a range of reasons. Actually, that's one of the themes of the book is the various different kinds of attractions that these kinds of movements have for people like that.
So I'm probably betraying a little bit of my prejudice as a journalist and someone in the book world that the pamphleteers, the bloggers, the spin doctors, the producer of TV programs and creators of memes, these are people that I can easily see supporting some of these autocrats. I guess I'm interested in what circumstances in which countries it's writers and intellectuals and what's behind that.
I mean, look, there have always been nationalist intellectuals and intellectuals and writers who supported dictatorships. I mean, that goes back well into the 20th century. One of the themes of the book, one of the kind of threads that runs through it is an analysis that was written, in the first half of the 20th century by a French writer called Julien Benda, called the It was called The Treason of the Clerks or The Treason of the Intellectuals. And it's a book about intellectuals who align themselves politically and who abandon their, search for truth or their objectivity in order to be part of political movements. So this urge to do that and to play a political role or to be the voice or to provide the ideas for a political movement is, I think it's as old as writing and public speaking itself.
Talk about how you've seen that in Poland, where you normally spend most of your time.
So the idea for the book came from my reflections about the history of Poland over the last 30 years, and especially some of the people who I felt aligned with in the 1990s. There was a kind of center-right anti-communist movement that was, it wasn't ever cohesive, but it was, the people within it certainly spoke to one another in the 90s who all had a similar vision of Poland and who all hoped for Poland that would be part of Europe and part of NATO and would be, some kind of democracy and connected to the world. Some of those people now have acquired a very different vision of Poland, and they hope that Poland becomes a kind of Catholic nationalist one-party state. They've been part of or supporters of a government that has cracked down on independent media and may be doing so further, that uses openly homophobic and anti-Semitic slogans in its election campaigns, and that I think worst of all really has sought to pack the courts in order to remove the independence of judges. And the transformation of those people is one of the subjects of the first part of the book. And again, I think their motives are various. Some of them are personal. They personally didn't like the political system that emerged in the 90s and 2000s, and they didn't feel they had a personal role in it. Some people felt Poland was losing something. They developed a nostalgia, some kind of mythical nostalgia for some other version of the country that they preferred that may have existed sometime in the past. In Poland's case, it's the pre-communist past. Some of them felt that Poland was losing its identity as it merged into Europe. Anyway, there are multiple reasons, but the overall impulse is one that I think Americans should be aware of too, because the attraction of authoritarianism or the attraction of the one-party state or the attraction of illiberalism, I think can be felt in lots of countries, including our own.
I want to stay with Poland for a minute and talk about some of those thinkers, writers, and others who you describe as moving towards this illiberal political inclination. These are people that you had associated with before this move and to some extent considered friends. You start your book off with a party that you threw on New Year's Eve in 1999. Can you talk a little bit about who was there and then subsequently what happened among those attendees looking back 20 years later?
Yes. Well, first of all, I use the party as a metaphor. I'm not a great hostess. I don't give that many parties. It was just a way of trying to write about political alliances. But yes, I thought about it many years later, and I realized that some of the people who were there, who were at the time mostly very junior, non-famous journalists, subsequently made careers for themselves. One of them is a well-known kind of public anti-Semite who writes and speaks a lot about how Jews, especially in America, are damaging Poland. He's included me in that category. I'm American. I'm Jewish background. I'm now a Polish citizen. I live there, but he and others now write about me as somebody who's harming Poland. And this goes back to a number of years. Another one is a woman who became a kind of internet troll. She promotes alt-right memes and, again, anti-Semitic and other, very aggressive material up on her Twitter feed. A third is a conspiracy theorist. She's somebody who writes a lot about a plane crash that took place in Poland a decade ago that killed the president of the country. It was indeed a great tragedy. And she has blamed it variously on the Russians and on the then sitting Polish government, implying that there's been this huge cover up and the society is hiding the fact that, the president was deliberately murdered. So these are, again, people who were, who I knew and who are now working hard to create a conspiratorial, and I guess the word is illiberal, but you could use worse words, political culture in Poland.
Where does this conversation play out? Is this on television? Is it largely on the internet? Where is this taking hold?
So some of these are people who work for magazines and newspapers. Some of them have big social media platforms. Some of them are writers. One or two of them have wound up working for the government, for the ruling party.
Is some of this generational? I mean, it sounded like you said these people, at least at your party in Poland, were sort of junior journalists and players in the media at the time of that party. Does that reflect the larger sort of movement that this is a kind of younger generation coming up?
Well, these aren't young people anymore. I mean, I'm afraid to say they're my age. So they're now people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, at the time, 2 decades ago, they were a younger generation. The generation I'm speaking about is people who were old enough to have a job and a public life of some kind in the 1990s, who were anti-communists, who were part of a coalition which ranged at that time from sort of left to right and liberal to conservative, that had happily overthrown the communist dictatorship and was looking forward to a kind of certainly a liberal democratic future for Poland. Since then, that coalition has broken up. Some of its members belong to recognizably center-left or center-right politics, and some of them have become very radical. I mean, actually, the great illustration of this is one of the stories that I tell in the book, which is of a pair of brothers who were both sort of anti-communist teenagers. They were both protested and joined demonstrations in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s started to go separate ways. And one of them is now the editor of the most important liberal newspaper in Poland. You could call it the Polish New York Times. The other is the head of state television in Poland, which is now a kind of propaganda outlet for the ruling party and is one of the places where this homophobic and anti-Semitic material now appears. These could not have been more similar in the past. They come from the same family. Their mother was also a prominent solidarity activist. And now they've chosen these completely different paths. And again, I don't have a simple or simplistic explanation for why that happened, but I look at the career of both brothers and ask whether, some combination of disappointment, frustration, and anger at the way things came out didn't affect the career of the brother who now runs state television.
What are the commonalities that between the situation that you've observed in Poland and some of the other countries that you talk about specifically in your book? Hungary with Viktor Orban, in the UK with Brexit and Boris Johnson and others, and in Russia, obviously, with Putin.
So none of these situations are identical. And what I wanted was for the different countries I look at in the book to kind of echo one another rather than being the same. I mean, you can see some elements of similarity. For example, in almost all of these radical right movements are born out of something that I describe as cultural despair, or sometimes as a kind of apocalyptic pessimism. The intellectuals behind them are often people who are disappointed with the country that they live in and the civilization as it is now. And sometimes this is about modernity, and sometimes it's about the speed of change, and sometimes it's about the end of traditional hierarchies, social hierarchies or sexual hierarchies. And sometimes it's about loss of a role in the world that they played in the past. That's very important in Britain. And that is a kind of echo. I mean, that you can hear in Poland, Hungary, Spain, Britain, for that matter, France and the United States. We're talking about people who really don't like their own societies and do believe that some kind of profound radicalism is necessary, some revolution, some abrupt change is necessary to either to bring things back the way they were before or to create something different and better.
This book is a kind of departure for you in that it's not a history, but more of an argument, an essay. Why did you decide to write this book and to take that approach?
Partly because I'm in the story. As I explain in the Poland chapter, I'm sometimes one of the objects. I'm sometimes one of the people who's attacked by the Polish right. My husband was a Polish politician. Again, I've lived a lot on and off over the last 20 years in Britain. I'm very attached to and involved in people here. I felt like it was a story that, because I was a spectator and a participant rather than an objective historian, gathering evidence and presenting the views of all sides, that the only way to tell it was from my point of view. So it is a very subjective book. It is not a memoir. It's not about my life, but there are stories of things that I remember happening in the past. I use that as part of the evidence that I'm gathering.
What was the experience of writing it like for you, given how different this is from the way that you've approached previous books?
A lot of it I found incredibly difficult. There was a lot of lying on the floor and staring at the ceiling and saying, do I really remember this? And what exactly do I really think about this person? Or what was that situation like? I did go back and interview people or talk even informally to people who were at events that I remembered and asked them if did it really happen the way I remember? What do you think is going on? So I did a kind of research that wasn't archival research, but I did go back and talk to other people who remember, the same events and who were there with me.
Are you working on another history now?
I do hope to eventually get back to writing real history. My next project actually is a book about 1989. What was that liberal anti-communist revolution? Why did it happen? And then maybe what happened afterwards? What happened during the 1990s? And, now that we have a couple of decades distance on it, maybe we can be more objective about what it did and didn't achieve.
Sounds like a very good moment to look at that time. And thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Anne Applebaum's new book is called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Barbara Demick joins us from New York to talk about her new book, Eat the Buddha, Life and Death in a Tibetan Town. Barbara, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
You wrote this book while you were the Beijing correspondent for the LA Times. How did you get interested in this particular area of China?
My previous book had been about North Korea. And, I guess I'm attracted to mysteries. And I feel that, so much of the world we know about from, Google Earth and maps and YouTube, and we feel like we can see everything everywhere. But Tibet was just such a mystery to me, and it was difficult to travel to. It was difficult to get permission to go to the Tibetan areas. And the culture was so unfamiliar to most Westerners like me who are not Buddhists, that it challenged me and it intrigued me.
One of the mysteries, I think, for many people who are not in China, and certainly for many Americans, is what is Tibet right now anyway? Because the area that you write about is not in what is considered the borders of the Tibetan Autonomous Region.
That's right. There's several definitions of Tibet. The Tibetan Plateau is like more than twice as large as what the Chinese, strictly speaking, define as Tibet, which is something they call the Tibet Autonomous Region. But the majority of Tibetans actually live outside of the Tibet Autonomous Region. So these parts of China in Sichuan, Qinghai, Yunnan, Gansu provinces, these are all Tibetan areas, and they look Tibetan, and the people are Tibetan. And if, it's a funny thing, there's a lot of Tibetans in New York, mostly in Queens. And if you run into somebody from Queens, chances are they're from this part of Tibet, and they'll say they're from Tibet. A Chinese government spokesman might say, no, they're not from Tibet, but they say they are. So there's many different definitions. The majority of Tibetans, a slight majority, come from these eastern parts of the Tibetan Plateau, which are a bit more developed. They're closer to China. And in some ways, they're more Tibetan than the Tibet Autonomous Region, which has become very Chinese.
That's so interesting. So when we talk about Chinese, we're talking about Han Chinese and sort of under the Beijing controlled Chinese government.
That's right. That's right. And the Han Chinese are the majority in China. And increasingly, they've moved into the Tibetan areas, especially into the Tibet Autonomous Region.
So in the eyes of the government, how are the Tibetan citizens of what is considered China proper, are they treated differently? Do they have different rights than the Han Chinese in those same areas?
Exactly. And that's a lot of what this book is about. And it's something that I think, resonates with Americans who are watching the Black Lives Matter protests. Tibetans are really second, third class citizens. They don't enjoy a lot of the same rights as the Han Chinese. This is also true of the Uyghurs in the Northwest. It's very, very difficult for Tibetans to get passports, so they can't travel abroad very freely. At points of when there's any kind of tension, it can be very difficult for them to travel within China. I mean, this changes frequently, but sometimes you can't go from one township to another township without paperwork. Sometimes it's difficult for them to go to Lhasa, which is really their spiritual home. I think they feel, sort of to use some of the terms that we see in the U.S. now, constantly racially profiled. And I mean, this is a point I make in the book a lot. I mean, there are some Tibetans who, will say, it would be enough if we just had the rights of Chinese people. We're not talking about Jeffersonian democracy. We're just talking about the same as everybody else.
How does the difference between the rights of these Tibetans and the rights of Han Chinese play out in everyday life, in terms of education, jobs, law enforcement?
For example, there's a lot of checkpoints throughout Tibet. Those checkpoints were there in Naba when I was traveling through there. I saw them in Lhasa, where I visited a few years ago. And often Han Chinese can go through checkpoints and Tibetans can't. Tibetans will be stopped randomly and their telephones will be searched for photographs or banned apps. That's especially true for Uyghurs who are in the Northwest.
That's the Muslim population.
That's the Muslim population. I've seen this. I mean, I sat actually at a cafe outside a checkpoint and watched, they just picked out the people who looked Uyghur and checked their phones. It's very difficult for them to get jobs. Some of it is official. Some of it is just private companies who only want to hire Han. Up to a few years ago, it wasn't unusual to see on a job board a sign would say Han only.
One of the things that happened in the specific area that you write about in Eat the Buddha in Naba County is there was a spate of self-immolations, obviously very extreme, particularly for Buddhists. Can you talk a little bit about what happened? And was that what drew you specifically to Naba County?
I was interested in writing about Tibetans before the self-immolation started in any great way. But I would say that was a good reason that I went to Naba County, because it was, wow, something's really happening here. But my interest was that I felt like Tibetans didn't really come out in current books, literature, even documentaries, and sort of their full personalities and with the texture of their lives. They tended to be seen as pawns in the larger geopolitical game between China and the Dalai Lama without much real agency of their own. And so it was very hard, unless you were very spiritual and very into Buddhism, to understand what it was like to be a Tibetan. And the kind of writing I do is all about getting the reader to empathize with the people, to really feel like this is what it would be like if I were them. But the self-immolations, obviously caught my attention.
What happened?
I think it was, pent up frustration from years of feeling neglected and oppressed. And they felt like they needed to, everybody had their own reasons, but people felt like they needed to do something to catch China's attention, to say, hey, look, we're not happy. One of the great lines of Chinese propaganda is how happy the Tibetans are. They produce some stories every year about how Lhasa is the happiest town in China and, happy Tibetans smiling and dancing. And there's all sorts of Twitter bots also spreading happy Tibetans. But they're not happy. And I think they wanted their displeasure to be known in a dramatic form. I think it also fits in with something that we've been reading about now. I've been reading a lot about John Lewis and his ideas about redemptive suffering. And, the idea, which, comes also from Mahatma Gandhi and other religious influences, that somehow you suffer, you endure pain, and it lifts you above your circumstances. And Tibetans began to think, some especially young Tibetans, began to think this was the only thing they could do. This was the only way they could be heard, the only way they could, powerfully express their displeasure with the system. And, once something starts, it does catch on. There is, a phenomenon called cluster suicide. But these were not kids who were just doing it because my friend committed suicide. I mean, they felt very strongly.
When was this and how many self-immolations do we know about?
It started in earnest in 2011. There was one case in 2009, but in 2011, it became, really a trend, and you had several every week, most of them in Naba, not all of them, but the greatest number were in Naba. And, another thing that was sort of funny at the time, I'd been reading Orhan Pamuk's book Snow, which is about a fictionalized Turkish town where a lot of young people commit suicide. And I was curious about it because it's so dramatic, but this was the real thing.
In all three of your books, we talked a little bit about Nothing to Envy, your book on North Korea, and your previous one, Logovina Street. You choose to tell your story through individuals. And I wanted to know how you came upon that model and why do you choose to write that way?
I like stories. I like people's stories. I'll sit next to somebody on the bus and hear, from their infancy to the present to how they met their spouse or divorced their spouse or didn't get a spouse. I like hearing people's individual stories. And I think everybody has a story. And it seemed like the way of getting my readers, and at that time it was daily newspaper readers, American daily newspaper readers, to really empathize with people who came from a very different background, whose names they couldn't pronounce, who were maybe from a place they couldn't find on the map. I'd say it started in Sarajevo. I was sent as a cub foreign correspondent to cover the wars in the former Yugoslavia. And I didn't really start till 94, at which point the wars were well underway and people were suffering from a kind of empathy fatigue. Just nobody wanted to hear about Bosnia. And it was what to do, how to make it alive for my readers. In that case, Philadelphia. I was working for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I thought if my readers could know these people the way I know them, they would care. And something I did, which was quite unusual at the time, is that I kept going back to the same group of people for all of my stories. Normally, as a foreign correspondent, say you're writing, about children wounded by snipers, you might, interview a couple of families, and then the next week you're doing something on the electricity shortage. But, your editor would say, well, we can't use them again because they were in last week's report. You're always finding new people. But I stayed with the same people, so they became real. And, I wanted my readers, my American readers, and sometimes, as we know, Americans can, well, anybody, will check out on, bad things that are happening far, far away. But I wanted my readers to really feel like, what would you do? What would you do if you were in Sarajevo and, all your utilities were turned off, the food disappeared from the market, and there were mortar shells falling. Can you imagine what your life would be like being in a modern city? I actually, at the beginning of the lockdown, I wrote a piece about this. because a lot of the things that happened early on in March and April really reminded me of my life in Sarajevo, because I lived in Sarajevo for a while. And I felt like the technique was really effective at getting people to care. And I thought it was, especially effective in North Korea, because North Koreans are, sort of, demonized by the foreign press. They come out as these stereotypes of, quote unquote, inscrutable Asians, this and that. They're shown goose stepping. It puts them really in a kind of stereotype. And, what I found when I started meeting North Koreans, they were really nice people. And, a lot of their concerns were the same concerns that I had and my friends. They worried about their children's education and their parents and their jobs and where their food was coming from. And our concerns were really first world concerns. But it was really easy to see them beyond the geopolitics. And that's what I wanted to do with Tibetans as well. I really wanted to get closer to them.
What did you find? Maybe you can tell through the story of one of the people who you write about in the book about Tibetans.
Well, there's a woman in the book who's called Pema, and she's not really one of the main characters, but she was somebody who I could really identify with. She came from a poor family. None of this happened to me. She was married very young to an uncle, to a man who he was married to her aunt, who already had a wife, and she was, uneducated, and, there was really nothing special about her. But she saw in the 80s and 90s, the development of China after reform and opening, and she saw how she could make money. And with very little education herself, she opened a stall in the market. She started selling fur hats. And then when the Dalai Lama told Tibetans they should stop selling furs, she switched to counterfeit sneakers. But she managed to educate her kids. Her son became a somewhat prominent Lama. And I could really feel sort of each step of her story myself, as though she was somebody I didn't grow up in such a deprived family, and I wasn't a child bride in a forced marriage, but I could really feel how we were alike. And that was true of most of the people. I think Tibetans, feel so deeply about their spirituality that they're quite religious. And sometimes that was hard for me to penetrate, their emotions about the Dalai Lama and about their culture. But, I could get them to explain it to me, so I felt like I was them, and that my readers would feel that they were them.
I want to talk about one other individual Tibetan because your book is dedicated to him. Who was Lobsang Choksa Trotsky?
I just called him Trotsky. That was his nickname, and it was the name of his village in Naba. He was really the first person I met from Naba. I had a letter of introduction to him from Wozer, who's a very prominent Tibetan poet who I knew from Beijing. And Trotsky was living then in Dharamsala and was like head of the Tibetan writers in exile, and was just a brilliant guy. He'd been a monk at Kirti, and he was working on sort of spreading awareness of Tibetan literature, which is vast and very sophisticated. This is not like some obscure minority language. He was like working on electronic apps to make Tibetan easier to type and easier to electronically translate. And it didn't exactly work for me, but he was helping me, and he introduced me to a lot of the other people I met from Naba. And, I haven't spoken about his death in some years. And so and I don't really write about it in the book, but it's still quite painful. We had gone to Delhi together to do an interview to an area called Majnukatila, which is the Tibetan neighborhood. And he had to leave early to get back to Dharamsala. And he was waiting for a bus and ran into somebody he knew, actually a monk. And that monk was angry with him over something that a friend of Trotsky's had written. Anyway, they had a fight, and the monk stabbed Trotsky and then stabbed himself to death. It was just this weird thing. This was all happening. I mean, I was maybe 50 meters away doing my interview. Somebody else was translating. He said, "Goodbye, good luck, have a good," And when I got out of the interview, I texted him and said, "Oh, that was a great interview. Thanks so much for setting it up." And I didn't hear back, but I thought, oh, the bus is gone, no reception. And about 4 or 5 hours later, I found out what happened. And I think because he was prominent in Penn, I'm sorry, I'm not being very coherent about this. Really, I haven't spoken about it in a few years.
Oh, it's okay.
He was prominent in Penn. There was some thinking that maybe there was some hand of the Chinese government involved. I don't think so. I think it was just really one of those senseless, crazy things.
Well, it's a very powerful way to honor him with this dedication.
It was his book in many ways, and because he was in his early 30s, he was young, and but he completely understood what I wanted to do. And often speaking to people like this, even if they're educated, when you start talking about narrative nonfiction and asking people very specific questions. So when you had this conversation, what were you wearing and what was the weather like? Because narrative nonfiction is really tough. You have to have the narrative, which requires a lot of detail, but the detail has to be true. So it's exhausting exhausting. But he really understood, what I was trying to do and why I was doing it.
Well, you have very powerfully pulled it off with this book. The book is called, again, Eat the Buddha, Life and Death in a Tibetan Town. It's reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. The book is, again, by Barbara Demick. Barbara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Alexandra Alter joins us now to give us some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
How are things?
Things are pretty good. I have some more good news after good news about sales last week. And this week they released the Booker long list, which is always exciting because it's kind of a snapshot of what the judges thought were some of the most significant literary works that they want to honor with a Booker this year. And it's always a big deal. This year was kind of an eclectic list. It was pretty interesting. So there were 13 books selected by a panel of 5 judges. And the only obvious candidate who was on the list, I thought, was Hilary Mantel for The Mirror and the Light. Of course, she has already won twice. So if she won again for the 3rd book in her Thomas Cromwell series, that would be sort of historic. Other people have won twice, but nobody has ever won 3 times. So that would be kind of exciting. Other sort of surprising things about the group of authors selected were that there were 8 debuts on the list, which was sort of interesting.
Who were the judges this year?
So there was, I think, an eclectic group of judges, which might have contributed to kind of the range of works that we saw in here. One of them is Lee Child, who's an author who's known more for his commercial fiction, for his Jack Reacher series. Another judge that I thought was an interesting choice is Emily Wilson, who's a classicist and translator, and she got a lot of acclaim for her translation of the Odyssey, which was sort of a reinterpretation in a way of the epic. And the other judges include Samir Rahim, an author and critic, and Lem Sisse, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, who is a writer and broadcaster, and Margaret Busby, who's the chair. And she is a former publisher, she's a literary critic, and an editor. There were a number of Americans on the list, which has been a source of consternation ever since they opened up the Booker, which used to be for the UK and Commonwealth authors, to any author who publishes in English and is published in the UK. So that has put a lot of Americans in the running. And this year, 9 of the 13 writers up for the prize are either American or have dual US heritage. So that's another interesting twist that we've seen playing out in recent years. And if you recall, last year was kind of a bizarre year because they awarded the Booker to 2 authors, Margaret Atwood and Bernadine Evaristo. That had never happened before, and that caused a lot of hand-wringing about kind of diluting the significance of the prize. And so I think they'll probably avoid that this year because it was such a controversial decision. But who knows? Maybe they'll give it to 3 because there are so many good books on the list.
I have to say, I count myself among those people who was disappointed when they allowed Americans in. I know that's very unpatriotic or un-American of me to say. But, one of the things I liked about the Booker is that there were all of these Commonwealth countries that were included, and it was a great way of discovering writers I'd never heard of, whether they were from the Antipodes or from Canada or parts of Africa. And I feel like, with 8 of the books on there from Americans, like, really? we already know about them. I mean, I'm happy for them to be honored and their work to become better known and all of that. But I guess as a reader, I find it a little bit less interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that is exactly the argument that people have made. Prizes are one way you can really put an author on the map kind of instantly and really make their career. And the Booker is one of those prizes that results in a huge sales bump. It will result in future book deals for that author and all kinds of recognition.
So this is the long list. When does the short list come out?
The short list will be announced on September 15th, and that will be 6 books. And the winner is announced in November. And that's the same month of the National Book Awards, which I'm also very interested in. They'll be releasing their long list in coming weeks, and then later their short list. And the National Book Awards is going to be a little different this year, as you can imagine. They're going to have the ceremony virtually instead of having it at Cipriani's with the black tie and the champagne. So it'll feel a bit different, but I'm sure it'll be exciting nonetheless. And of course, in the fall, we also have the Nobel. I just can't believe we're already creeping into literary awards season in the height of summer.
Everything, it's no longer spread out. Everything is going to happen on top of each other. And there's also an election. We're going to be busy
That's right.
people. All right, Alexandra, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Tina Jordan and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela. Hi, Tina.
John, let's start with you. It's been a while. What are you reading?
It has been a while. I am reading something that I started and then got dragged away from for work reasons, and so I have to go back and finish it. But it's a very entertaining, pretty short novel called A Way of Life Like Any Other by a writer named Darcy O'Brien. Darcy O'Brien is a man. This was released originally in 1977. It's now out from the New York Review of Books Classics line, which is a great resource in general. This is a book by someone who was the child of 2 actors in Hollywood. His father was a silent film star. His mother was a co-star of John Wayne's in several movies, and I think acted in other things. Neither of their names are very familiar to me, so I don't think they're still world famous or anything. But he essentially grew up around a lot of glamour, and this is his first novel. He apparently went on to write true crime books, and so this, I think, is sort of out of character for him, but it was his first book and pretty well received. I think it might have even won a prize. And as I joked recently on Twitter, I can sell this book, I think, by just reading you the its fiction disclaimer in the beginning and then the first paragraph, which Pedro might have to bleep a word at the very end, but we'll see. If he's feeling generous, he won't have to. The fictional disclaimer says, any resemblance between persons living or dead and characters in this fiction is purely fortuitous, except that famous persons appear under their own names. And then the first paragraph. I would not change the beginning for anything. I had an electric car, a starched white nanny, a pony, a bed modeled after that of Napoleon's son, and I was baptized by the Archbishop of the diocese. I wore hats and sucked on a little pipe. I was the darling of the ranch, pleasing everyone. One day I was sunning myself in the patio, lying out on the yellow and blue tiles, contemplating the geraniums and sniffing the hot, clean air. A bee came up and stung me on my bare fanny. The response to my screams was wonderful. Servants everywhere, my mother giving orders. Don Enrique applied an old Indian remedy, and my father took me down to the beach house to let the salt water do its work. Oh, what a world it was. Was there ever so pampered an ass as mine?
I'm going to say let's leave the ass and the fanny, which I have more a problem with the fanny, which I think is one of the most embarrassing words in the English language.
Bleep the fanny, Pedro. We'll have a bunch of bleeps when we say fanny here. So there is, tragedy in his parents' divorce, and he sort of shuffles between them. But there's this voice is an overused word, I think, when it comes to writing, but it's so voice driven, just like that first paragraph. And there's a lot of mordant wit and era specific glamour. So I'm going to probably finish that up over the weekend.
It sounds delightful.
It does,
it is.
John. If we were in the office, I would be like reaching over to snatch it off your desk when you were done.
We'll see if I can get it in a jiffy to you when I'm done.
Tina, what have you got?
So I'm reading a book called The Decent Inn of Death by a writer named Rennie Erth, whom I did not know. I looked up. He does have a website. All it says on his bio, which is one line long, is that he was born in 1935 in South Africa and became a journalist and now lives in Italy. So I know nothing else about him.
When is this book from? Is it recent?
It's recent, yes.
Oh, okay.
So he began writing classic British mysteries about a dozen years ago, as far as I can tell. And I don't know about either one of you, but I'm having trouble with a lot of the kinds of books that I usually read, and I'm finding myself turning both to humorous books and to mysteries and thrillers, just like plot-driven page turners. And although this isn't a page turner in the sense that like a modern thriller is, it's kind of got a slow build. What I love about this series, and now I'm 4 books in, is that much in the way that Elizabeth George or even Tana French does, he has a cast of familiar characters, but he plucks one out in each book to focus on. And the books seem to have a wide range of dates. They're set between the 2 world wars and shortly after World War II in England. The one I read last week, which was called The Blood-Dimmed Tide, was set in 1932. But these are the kind of mysteries where the most important things are the characters. And the plots themselves are a pretty slow build. It takes a while for things to get moving, but then when they do, they move very fast. The one that I'm reading now opens when this particularly one of my favorite characters, this retired Scotland Yard chief inspector named Angus Sinclair, who's really grumpy because all he has to do is watch his blood pressure, goes to visit friends in a small town in Hampshire where everyone is upset because the village's church organist, who actually wasn't a very good organist, has slipped, fallen, and drowned in the creek. Except for maybe she hasn't slipped and fallen. Maybe somebody pushed her there. So I'm about halfway through, and I just have to say it's the kind of easy, pleasant, smart, engaging mystery that I like.
It's quite a title, too.
It is a great title. In fact, every single one that I've read has had a great title. I mean, The Blood-Dimmed Tide was also a good title.
That's a famous one. That's a great title.
Yeah. Anyway.
Pamela, what about you? What are you reading this week?
Well, it's interesting. Tina, I too am in that kind of escapist mode of reading. I think mine is a little bit the funny and a little bit the thrilling, but I would say the common theme is like anywhere but here. Mm-hmm. And so the book that I just finished definitely falls into that category because it's about neither here nor now. The book is Scott Anderson's Lawrence in Arabia, War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. Tina, you've read this book, right?
I have. It's been a while, but I've read it.
Yeah. So this book came out. It's by a writer, Scott Anderson, who writes for the New York Times Magazine, among other places. And it came out in 2013. I was at the book review. And he has another book that's coming out this fall that I think takes a similar model, which is that it's a kind of group biography. And in this case, he's writing primarily about T.E. Lawrence, but also about 3 other more minor characters. Karl Prüfer, who was a German who was working in the Middle East at the time. He was attached to the German embassy in Cairo. Aaron Aronson, who was a Zionist who was also working in the area and was an agronomist, which is a word that I think that Scott Anderson really likes because very often in the book he'll say, the agronomist turned to his companion and said, I think it's like the word industrialist. It's just a word that's kind of fallen out of usage, but is kind of alluring. And then the 4th person in this quartet is an American named William Yale of the Yale family, after which the university is named, who is kind of American fallen aristocrat. His family lost all of its money and he went to work for Standard Oil and then became, I guess, kind of one of the only, if not the only, American spy in the Middle East during World War I. And the reason I picked up this book was because I was watching, I think for like the fourth time, Lawrence of Arabia, which is a movie I just love. And I was watching it with my 13-year-old son. The last time I saw it, I think, was at the Ziegfeld Theater. So that also felt like very much a different time and place, another era. And my son was asking questions about what the character of Prince Faisal says in his initial meeting in the tent with T. Lawrence about the Middle East and about Saudi Arabia in particular, and its kind of fall from an era of dominance. And my son was like, well, why did it fall? And what happened subsequently? And it was one of those things that happens when you have kids and you're like, let me just Google this because I didn't know the answer. So I turned to the book, and I have to say this is yet another instance in which reading the book, I don't want to say that it ruined the movie, but it a little bit did. It's kind of like, the experience I had with Ted Chiang's The Story of Your Life and the movie Arrival. I love the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and essentially have learned in this book, Lawrence in Arabia, that everything in the movie is totally wrong. And, I should have known, that Hollywood does this. But it really was disappointing to find out that so much of that movie is just completely made up. But the book, nonetheless, I enjoyed it. It gets into a lot of the sort of Middle East theater of World War I. And, with books like this, the comparison in my head is with Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, which is another book I love. And that's really about the Western Front in Europe in World War I. When it gets into the intricacies of the various battles, my interest wanes. But what I thought was most interesting about this book is that it really does clarify part of that subtitle, The Making of the Modern Middle East, in that you understand how so much of what ended up taking place in the Middle East is a function of colonialism and war and the ways in which these, mostly Western European countries went in, and it's primarily Britain and France in this case, and operated as if this was just like a piece of property to carve up, and used these countries and these tribes and various leaders and religious groups in ways that served their own interests, very much to the detriment of the countries and the people in question. And just to give one tiny example, in helping the British, who were allegedly helping the Saudi Arabians, Faisal ended up completely changing the course of Saudi Arabian history, because anything that then went wrong for the Saudi Arabians and for the Arabians really, was not necessarily purely the fault of the British then, but of the people who were now complicit in helping the British bring this about. And so what ended up happening in Saudi Arabia is that the Sauds, who were the Wahhabis and the sort of more extreme faction in terms of religion, came in and took over Saudi Arabia, largely because Faisal and his family was discredited as a consequence of the way in which the war played out for his people. What I want to read next in this area is really to look very specifically at Saudi Arabia and how did that happen? How did the House of Saud sort of come in and where things went from there? I don't know, Tina, what were your impressions of this book? I know it's been a while.
I remember loving it, but it's also the kind of history told in such a narrative fashion. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
It's told as a story, and that's my favorite kind of history to read.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. I think these four characters was a little bit of a construct because, some of the characters were clearly more consequential than others. And obviously, like the main figure is Lawrence of Arabia, as reflected in the title. But for the most part, I thought he really succeeded.
Yeah.
I have to confess that I've never seen the movie.
Okay, John, this is a real problem.
I know.
This came up in a side conversation after we stopped recording in a previous podcast, and I really hoped you would fix it in the interim.
Well, you probably didn't expect me to shame myself publicly.
That's usually my job. But, I think you need to see this movie and just delete everything I said. It's totally true. Get caught up in the romance and the excitement of it and pretend that I never said that any of it was,
I do want to see it, but I do think that it's something I have to wait for the real world to resume for, because I know that it's something you have to see on the real big screen.
It is. Either that or
for the first time.
Or a really big television. All right, let's run down the titles of what we read. John?
I read A Way of Life Like Any Other by Darcy O'Brien.
And I read The Decent Inn of Death by Rini Erth.
And I read Lawrence in Arabia, War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East by Scott Anderson. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.